Hello and welcome. We're so excited you're here. My name is Lucinda Vakura. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Vice President of Business Development and Marketing with Alford Group. And I have short brown hair. I'm wearing glasses today and a black turtleneck with a background of a bookcase and a plant. And we're excited to have you here to join us. The title of today's presentation is Donor Archetypes, a practical guide to building belonging. And before we dive into the information, I want to talk a little bit about Alford Group and go over a few webinar logistics. So first, a little bit about Alford Group. We are a national full-service consultancy serving the nonprofit community. We specialize in the 6 flagship services that you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. We are a proud member and sponsor of AFP, the Association of Fundraising Professionals. We are certified Women's Business Enterprise and a proud member and sponsor of the Giving Institute, of which our president and CEO, Brenda Sari, currently serves as the chair. If you would like more information about who we are and what we do, our website is alford.com, and that's a great place to check us out. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we reside. I realize that you all are joining from across the country and many different places, but I want to acknowledge Chicago, Illinois, which is the headquarters of Alford Group. Chicago is located on the traditional unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox, also called this area home. The region has long been a center for Indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. A few webinar logistics. So first of all, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the resources from this webinar, including the deck, that's always a question. We will be sending out the deck. All of that you'll be receiving from us within the next 24 hours via email. So keep an eye in your inbox. Secondly, after we conclude here today, you'll be prompted to complete a very short survey. It's about 4 questions. Please consider filling it out. It gives us really valuable feedback for future events and future webinars like this. Today, everyone is in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. However, as many of you have already found, the chat is open. So please do say hi, let us know where you're joining us from, what organization you're with, and we hope that the chat is a nice commentary and dialogue throughout today's presentation. However, if you have a very specific question that you want to ask of the presenters today, we ask that you use the Q&A function. There's a separate icon, separate from the chat, on your navigation bar. And if you open that window and type in your question, that will go directly to the moderator and the presenters, and we will answer as many questions as we can at the end of today's presentation. So with that, I want to introduce our moderator and kick us off today. I invite Jaron Bernstein, my friend and colleague from Alford Group, to kick us off and introduce us to our key presenters today. Thanks, Jaron.
Thanks so much, Lucinda. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us for what I think will be a really timely conversation. My name is Jaron Bernstein. My pronouns are he, him, and I am a senior consultant with Alford Group. I am a light-skinned man of Ashkenazi Jewish descent. I have short reddish-brown hair and a beard. And today I'm wearing a green sweater on top of a light gray button-up shirt, and my background is blurred. So as you know by now, the title of today's webinar is Donor Archetypes, a Practical Guide to Building Belonging. Fundamentally, the focus of our conversation today will be about our approach to relationship building. As nonprofit fundraisers and professionals, we are increasingly navigating the growing pressures of the giving crisis, which has seen the percentage of American households donating to nonprofits decrease over the past couple decades. We've especially seen a decrease in the number of small dollar donors to nonprofit organizations. Understandably, in the face of this pressure, we often feel compelled to focus primarily on meeting immediate fundraising goals. However, this urgency can sometimes lead to us missing a deeper and more meaningful opportunity, which is fostering a sense of true belonging among our supporters and welcoming others to be a part of our cause. So, how do we do that? When we are pressured to meet increasing fundraising goals by upgrading current donors and finding new ones, we naturally focus on the ask. But as we all know, there is so much more that needs to happen before we make it to that point. Today, we'll explore the idea of donor archetypes as a framework for rethinking how we speak to and engage with our donors, ensuring that our strategies are not just transactional, but transformative for both our organizations and the communities we serve. So with that, I'm excited to introduce our communications experts from Yes and Lipman Hearne and invite them to share more. So please help me welcome and invite to join on camera Colleen O'Grady and Andrew Ty. Andrew Ty is the Senior Vice President of Strategic Planning at Yes and. He has over 16 years of experience overseeing marketing teams and leading brand, digital, social, experiential, communications, and customer service strategies in both New York and DC. During his tenure at Ogilvy and Mather and Anomaly, he worked across verticals with a variety of clients, including Nestle, Pfizer, Coca-Cola, Marriott, and Dick's Sporting Goods. He spent several years also at Memorial Sloan Kettering, overseeing fundraising events and donor experience marketing teams. He's also launched the most successful Kickstarter project in DC history, which is Music for Cats, and I would love to learn more about that personally. His focus at Yes and is on helping nonprofit, commercial, and government brands connect with their audiences, both rationally and emotionally, across the many touch points of a customer journey. Colleen O'Grady is the Vice President of Philanthropic Strategy at Yes and Lipman Hearne. With more than 20 years of experience in nonprofit strategy and communications, she has helped launch billion-dollar plus campaigns for Caltech, the Chicago Community Trust, the Nature Conservancy, and others, as well as 2 consecutive campaigns for the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. She takes pride in providing clients with the tools to deepen connections with their supporters. And with that, I'll turn it over to Colleen and Andrew.
Thank you, Jaron and Lucinda. I'm so appreciative of this knowledge leadership series that you host. And as I share my screen, I'm eager to launch into this webinar today. Are you seeing the proper view of my screen?
Yes.
Not the preview mode? Okay, perfect.
Mhm.
Well, what we're going to talk about today is something that we are calling donor archetypes. And we'll start with a look at some of the ways that we tend to think about and engage donors in a process of building their engagement over time. And there are different stages that we want to be aware of that we might be using more productively to give people a deeper sense of belonging and a more of a sort of welcoming experience. We'll talk a little bit about what archetypes are, how they function in our brains, and then we'll talk about the 9 archetypes in detail. And then we'll talk through some tools that we hope will be useful to you and adaptable to your specific situation that'll help you sort of expand your ability to be offering this experience to your donors. A little bit about Yes and Lipman Hearne. We're a marketing and branding agency. We're not sociologists. We're not preparing this research for publishing, but we're always preparing ourselves to be of service to the nonprofits that we serve. And that includes looking closely at the kind of behaviors that we're observing in the world and the kinds of things that we think indicate opportunities that might be being missed that we can prepare ourselves to address more thoroughly. When we talk about centering individual donors, one of the tools we use is this marketing funnel. Many organizations probably have a version of this, which is a way of looking at the audiences that might be coming to your nonprofit, becoming aware of you, and then going through a process of evaluating and making decisions and transactions so that they can one day become, your sustaining supporters and your most tightly involved supporters. And often the conversation, especially when you're under pressure, as everyone is, to meet an annual goal, that the conversation tends to focus on things like the mechanics of the transaction and whether the person feels persuaded in the moment to make a gift. And those are important questions to ask. But as you can sort of see from the shape of this funnel, we think that there are a lot of people who might be dropping out of the process before they even get to the point of making that question or asking that question. And so we want to kind of turn the attention for today to that very early stage when someone is becoming aware of you. And we almost liken it to a person arriving at a party and seeing all the different clusters of people gathered on the porch of the party. And people are scanning the room to see, do I see people who sort of think about things the way I do? Do I see people that I'm going to want to talk with? Do I feel welcome here? And, is this even for me? And so one of the ways that we think about doing that is using storytelling or character archetypes. And I'm going to pass this over to Andrew to talk a little bit about what archetypes are and how they function.
Thank you so much, Colleen. So, I think we're all pretty familiar with it, whether we even know it or not, with archetypes, because, if you think about over the history of time, there are recurring characters that our brains recognize. They help us identify other people, but perhaps even more importantly, build a sense of belonging ourselves by understanding who we are and how we relate to the people around us. So, we're going to start with a bit of a story about puffins here. As some of you may or may not know, puffins, like us humans, are extremely social creatures. They, like us, they want to fit in, and they ultimately look for others who are recognizable to us. And if it's ultimately a close enough match, we start to emulate what we're seeing, in order to sort of and what we're seeing modeled socially, in order to sort of figure out kind of what our own behavior should be and act like. So this was a phenomenon, I think it was from Iceland, where in order to attract more puffins to a certain area, they put statues of puffins to sort of, again, like attract puffins there. And as it turns out, the statues looked like they were sort of operating on one leg. And as it turned out, that was a modeled behavior that several puffins were observed to actually go about doing themselves and standing on one leg, as you can kind of see here. So, again, from a donor standpoint, our goal is really to communicate to donors a sort of a varied set of stories, right? To help them see themselves in the stories that we're telling, to again help whoever comes across your organization feel welcome and inspired rather than sort of mystified and out of place. So again, what they do is they really help us get to the meat of a story more quickly. Because again, like our own brains, I'm sure your own brains does this. We all do this every day. I don't know, for those of you who are familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work and behavioral science, there's a lot of things that we do in our everyday lives and shortcuts that our minds take because we need them to. And archetypes and sort of categorizing people is frankly one of the ways that we do that. Again, it helps get us to the meat of a story more quickly because we subconsciously and consciously, by the way, will recognize the archetypes that we see out in the world. You may have some, these are from the world of pop culture. We've got some of your investigator as a part of the X-Files here. Mulder and Scully, those are scholars, right? People sort of that are really investigating things. That's, again, another archetype that we're pretty familiar with in pop culture. The warrior, in this case, someone from the Avengers franchise, again, sort of like standing for what's right and we willing to fight for that. And then you have the eccentric, right? Willy Wonka being a perfect example of that. So there are a bunch of types of archetypes. You guys, by the way, may also be familiar with archetypes as they're associated with brands themselves. Nike, for example, is a pretty prominent example of the hero archetype. And so again, like different sort of characters in our lives, both in pop culture and outside of it, can play these roles, and the people that we know in our everyday lives oftentimes map to these types of archetypes. So what we're going to go through here is ultimately later on in this presentation is the donor archetypes that we've synthesized for you all. But we wanted to start off with a quick little poll for you all. Which is, what was a nickname that was sort of given to this Olympic gymnast, and what was he known by? And you can pick A, B, C, D, or E. A being the specialist, B, pommel horse guy, C, Clark Kent, D, spider monkey, or E, Paul. So we'll give you guys maybe 30 to 45 seconds to fill out this poll, and then we'll see what the results are. But we wanted to take a recent example from the real world for those of you who may have watched some of the Olympics over this summer. All right. Well, it looks like we've already started to see some results go in. I'm seeing about half of you put pommel horse guy. About 40% put Clark Kent, and then there were a smattering of others with the specialist and spider monkey as well. Only one of you put Paul. As it turns out, actually A through D are all correct. This guy's name is Steven Nedorozic. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. Paul is actually a different gymnast on the U.S. team. But ultimately, one of the reasons why this moment was so sort of resonated across, social media and across, sort of regular media as well and traditional media, was because it tapped into the embedded awareness that we have of a certain archetype. In this case, it was a person with a very specialized skill, kind of flying below the radar and then coming through in a very clutch moment. For those of you who aren't aware of sort of what took place, again, he was wasn't really prominently featured. There were people wondering who is this guy on the gymnastics team who didn't seem to be doing much. And then when he was needed most for his team, he went and crushed his pommel horse routine and helped the team win its medal. So again, this is the idea that even though we are not ourselves elite athletes, most of us, we could still relate to this because we understand the archetype that was at the core of what it was. So again, that's just an example from the real world that we figured would get us into the right mindset. But with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Colleen to start going through the 9 donor archetypes that we've got to share with you today. And then we'll talk about how to sort of utilize those afterwards.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And the reason that we like sharing that example from the Olympics is that not a lot of people would right out of the gate imagine themselves as elite athletes or think about things the way that person might. But what we like to see is stories that are told about those athletes that do contain an element that's relatable. So when we think about donor archetypes, we're looking for qualities and ways of thinking about the world that seem to be found in these donor stories that we see in the culture, so that we can extract those elements, package them into easily memorable archetypes, and then give communicators tools for sort of opening up their thinking about the stories that they're telling the world about who a donor is and who a donor might be, or kinds of different ways that are all allowable and invited to participate in giving. So as we were preparing this set of archetypes, we going back I think 6 or 7 years now, we've been looking at personal statements that are being published by Giving Pledge signers, in which they articulate the reasons behind their own decision to make this pledge to give their wealth during their lifetimes to nonprofit purposes. And then we're also looking at media coverage of gifts and giving and doing some social listening, because we don't only want this set of archetypes to be informed by ultra high net worth individual giving, but by the stories that are told about people who maybe bring a different lens to it or a different type of resources, so that we're not risking alienating any potential donors. So the set of 9 archetypes are listed here. We're going to go through each of these in sort of 3 by 3 and outline a little bit about what are some of the things that might make you that might be recognizable or relatable to people that are hearing these stories out in the wild. And the first of these is the closer. This is somebody that brings a really a special expertise or specialized resource that few others can offer. I think in baseball, there's a position called a closer, which is a pitcher. They're not brought into every situation, but they're brought into, special moments. This gymnast that we looked at just now is also another example of this, where, when it's their moment to shine, they really step in. And the second is a strategist. This is someone that is looking at getting to the root of an issue, very comfortable working behind the scenes, quietly, sort of taking things apart to see how they work, and then putting them back together in an even better way. And then something that looks like a little bit of a contrast to that is an enthusiast, someone who just values the novel experience of being a philanthropist or being philanthropic, who really recognizes and values that as something that brings joy to their life and is really core to their experience. We look at something like we use this word mantras to talk about what is the sort of core position that we think this person might be standing for. For a closer, this is my time to shine. I can bring something special to this situation. A strategist, committed to understanding this problem at a macro and micro level. And these are the sort of badges that they're wearing that they want to show the world. For the enthusiast, this brings me joy and happiness. This enriches my life, full stop. And then what is the quest that these people are on? What are they trying to accomplish in the world? Whether it's moving the needle single-handedly or by rallying others, doing something that others couldn't accomplish on their own. Maybe it's adding to the volume of knowledge while making a difference, really being part of that problem-solving team, or enjoying and reflecting on this novel experience, building quality relationships that are bringing meaning to their life. And finally, looking at the personality that we think is inhabited by each of these archetypes. For a closer, this is somebody that's going to come across as courageous, insightful, very at ease, taking risks. In fact, they kind of prefer that space when the moment is right. For a strategist, this is someone who's inquisitive, they're diligent, they're very, in the details, skilled, patient, focused. And the enthusiast is someone who is open and friendly, really responsive, loves to meet people and engage with them and learn, and are sort of thoughtful about the process and the experience of being a donor. So this is the first set of three contrasting to one another. I'm going to pass it over to Andrew, who will talk through the next set of three.
Yeah, so to build off that, again, the nice thing about archetypes is again that they're quick ways of referencing certain types of gatherings of personality traits and again how they kind of view the world. So these are somewhat self-explanatory, but to give you some more in-depth understanding of each of these, the first is this explorer, right? And again, it kind of makes sense, but this is someone who is mindful of risk, but ultimately sort of like wants to proceed gradually while learning, right? I think it's sort of perhaps in the if you're thinking about it from a Myers-Briggs standpoint, someone who needs to sense things out before sort of understanding how to do things versus going maybe by intuition as much. Then have your world builder, right? Someone who sees sort of giving and nonprofits and philanthropy as instrumental to ultimately advance some sort of agenda, whatever that agenda might be. And then the power shifter, who is someone who wants to correct imbalances of power and ultimately help people who need more help and give them sort of, and again, the giving them more agency through their giving. And so with that, sort of like the mantras that are associated with them, the explorer, you might hear them say things like, I want to make a difference, sort of in taking, sort of like doing that takes care and thought. It sort of isn't something that you can just sort of like do off the bat or perhaps make an intuitive decision on, but something that the person needs to kind of dig into and really get their hands on to understand how they want to make that difference. The world builder, right? The idea of advancing their agenda, whatever that agenda might be. And the power shifter mantras around sort of people who are closer to this issue than I am, they do know best, and we need to speak to them. I need to know what is sort of what's going through their minds, and they deserve trust. They deserve a chance. They deserve an opportunity. So again, some of the keywords that might help you understand when you're, communicating with or speaking to different donors, how their mindset might align with some of these archetypes. In terms of what they're questing after, right? The explorer is all about gathering knowledge, right? Not making gut decisions, learning the context, avoiding mixed steps, again, making sure that they kind of understand the depth of the topic that you're talking about. The world builder is going to leverage advantages and resources towards some sort of vision of their own, right? So again, less about understanding and exploring sort of how the impact can most be made, but they kind of have an idea in their head of how they think that impact can be most can be made best, and they're going to sort of like use information to kind of support that worldview. And that vision that they have. And then the power shifter is again going to try to see and correct power imbalances, right? To listen and adjust and try to understand the perspectives of those sort of like across the sort of power spectrum. And then some personality traits and characteristics that define them, right? The explorer likely to be sort of humble, very curious, capable, but cautious in sort of like new territory, again, wanting to explore and really kind of make things tangible for them before making decisions. Whereas the world builder is very self-driven, right? Comfortable wielding power, sort of like an understanding of, again, taking information and kind of understanding how it might be used to sort of better the world in the sort of like with the perspective that they've got in terms of building that better world. And then the power shifter is going to be very mindful of power dynamics. Bold at times, sort of like pretty easy going with ambiguity, and maybe more comfortable with that. So again, like these are just maybe some helpful characteristics and qualities that may help you identify where some of your donors fall in. And again, worth noting, by the way, that these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but that ultimately that people will probably identify and self-identify with some of these more than others. And Colleen's going to go through the latter three before we get into some exercises.
Yeah, that's a good reminder that, many individuals who are, fully well-rounded individuals in the world are going to see in themselves or identify with more than one of these elements, or see inspiration in a variety of different types of donors that they observe. And so our goal isn't to try to, label our donors and pigeonhole them into one way of thinking about the world, but more to sort of are thinking about fact of the variety that we see in this set. Set of 9 includes the calculator. This is someone that really believes and wants there to be an objective way to measure the effectiveness of their giving and to make sure that it's efficient. These folks are, maybe thinking about, what constitutes a well-made gift as a sort of philosophical question. A lot of those folks you'll see using the term effective altruism. That's something that we've been seeing more and more discussion of lately. And then someone that we're calling the free spirit. And this is someone who likes to do things differently and maybe build movements, defy norms. But in this way of looking at the experience of giving, there is a real irreverence and a sort of desire to break against the mold. And that's part of the value of the experience for this person, that they are, kind of kicking against what's expected and getting kind of a thrill and a joy and some motivation from that. And then finally, the helper. This is actually, we saved this for last because this is the depiction of a donor that we think is kind of most commonly relied on. This is someone that just values making an immediate impact and the feeling of helping. That's a totally legitimate and, real way of looking at problem solving that is found in the world, but it's not the only way of thinking about giving. Looking at the mantras that each of these folks, these sort of extrapolated folks would be thinking about. A calculator is saying, I'm more confident when I can objectively measure and compare options. That sense of objectivity and of having confidence in that is very important. For a free spirit, they're thinking, we want to mix things up. Let's just try to kick at the wheels of this thing and see if we can do it a better way. And then if I can help in some small way, why not do it? It's not too complicated. If they, make a difference in someone's life, that's a win. The quest that they're on. This calculator archetype is on a quest to propose and test different measurement methods to maximize impact, to make a dollar go as far as possible and toward the right kinds of impacts. There's controversy in that, but it's sort of a clue into a type of personality, of way of looking at this question. For a free spirit, they're on a quest to model novel approaches, to model this sense of maybe injecting chaos in a productive and a playful way, rebelling, generating conversation. And then the helper is looking to stay open to ways to help, maybe developing a sense of gratitude and a sense of abundance in their own life. And then personalities that we are seeing for the calculator, this might be someone that is seen as, or wants the world to see them as, brainy, earnest, exacting and precise. A free spirit is rebellious in nature, a little bit playful. They're comfortable with attention and blowing things up a little bit. And then the helper is someone that is coming across as generous, big-hearted, but not overthinking things. So that was a speed run through this set of 9 archetypes. We want to pause for a second and ask which of these 9 archetypes resonated most with you. We'll give that a few seconds to sort of for folks to process.
Yeah, feel free to take a bit of time to kind of check them out because again, you'll maybe gravitate towards a couple of them. We're kind of interested in perhaps if there is one that you see as most primarily like yourself, would be interested in how that shows up. We have some hypotheses going into a webinar like this about where some of our audiences might skew, but yeah, feel free to use that polling technology, and then we'll see where we net out. Give another 5 to 10 seconds. People to vote. All right. Wow. Okay, this is very interesting. A pretty varied and diversified set of webinar participants today. That may not come as much of a surprise. The most common answer was the strategist. There was 9 of you that considered yourself to align most closely with that. There were 7 power shifters, and then basically pretty diversely scattered across the other archetypes. I'll say myself, I consider myself to be an enthusiast within this, even though a strategist is part of my title, ironically. We did not have very many closers. We only had 2 of those amongst the audience. But again, as I think this is sort of an indication, right, that like Colleen mentioned, while the helper sort of may be the archetype that we lean towards in many sort of ways, there are people, gravitate towards a bunch of different ones, and it's a pretty diverse set of them that we as humans identify with. So also very good for us to kind of keep that in mind. And I think that this is sort of like, again, a small focus group here, but an understanding of the diversity that people see them as, right? Because these are based on stories that are told throughout history, throughout culture, and so that we've seen ourselves gravitate towards certain ones over the course of our lives. And it was really interesting to see the diversity with you all. So again, worth noting, going into how to utilize these. So that's what we're going to take you through is a bit of a toolkit on how you can tell a more welcoming and inclusive set of stories using the sort of archetypes as a foundation. And what we're going to do is take you through kind of like a 3-part toolkit that we think sort of would be helpful to begin executing upon by actually holding 3 different brainstorming sessions. So again, we recommend kind of gathering your team. This could sort of be your own actual team, sort of insiders who know your donors, perhaps even if you know some of the donors themselves, those who are going to be tasked with making the stories visible for 3 different sessions. They can be sort of up to an hour. Again, you can spend as much time on this as you'd like, but it's also, we want to mention, it's very much okay to break this up over the course of several weeks because they're meant to kind of build on one another. And Colleen will take you through them. But the first one is your channels and vehicles. This is sort of like starting with an understanding and a bit of an audit of where and how, what are the channels that in the vehicles that you have through which to share stories, right? Where and how you're going to share these stories that are signaling varied approaches to giving and again, to share stories that would resonate to people who gravitate towards different archetypes. The next is story elements, right? The specific attributes and details found in the stories you might tell to tell that sort of varied approaches to giving. And then finally, your source material, right? What are some prompts and avenues through which you can actually go about gathering what you need to support these richly varied stories, because you're probably not going to have them, just literally in your back pocket. So these are some helpful tools for that. So with that, we'll go into the first session, which is about channel and vehicle inventory.
Yeah, thanks. So our goal in this toolkit is to, we don't think that it's productive to try to assign everybody a lot of homework or tasks that involve relabeling or recategorizing all the donors that are in your donor base, but rather approach it from the end of what it is that might be out in the world that your prospective donors could be seeing. Let them choose and sort of decide for themselves which things are inspiring or which things they might respond to. But what we're hoping is that this creates space for you to be creative about the ways you weave in story elements into your existing channels. So the first step is to take this inventory of all the channels that you currently are using and that you might gradually, maybe all at once or maybe gradually over time, start to weave in little micro stories that start to advance different ideas about who a donor is and what types of donors are welcome at your organization. So looking at channels, these are what we mean by channels are, things like short form social media, maybe a series of Instagram grid posts. And what we see commonly is when organizations make an announcement of a gift, the most common thing that we often see is the name of the donor, the amount of the gift, sometimes the purpose that the gift was intended to, but we rarely see any kind of insight into the decision-making process that led them there or the kind of thing that they're hoping to accomplish, other than making the direct impact that is sort of clear about why the gift was made to that purpose. But thinking about things like having, whether that gift sort of felt a certain way to them, or whether that gift is likely to have a long-term strategic impact, or at least yield some information that will inform long-term strategic impact. So when we think about something like a series of Instagram grid posts that might feature testimonial quotes from donors, that's an opportunity to start to reveal and unpack some of those motivators that could be behind those donor stories. We can, this will be different for every institution, but you might also be looking at using long form social media like in-depth posts on LinkedIn. You might be looking at video compilations of donor testimonials that can be shared at an event. And every one of these touch points is an opportunity to look at, perhaps past instances of communications like this, and you can sort of evaluate the stories that you have been telling and try to identify, have you been telling people stories of donors that are primarily helpers or primarily strategists, or maybe a mix of many different archetypes and more that aren't even on this list of 9. But what we're hoping to do is give you some prompts that will allow you to not create, build, reinvent the wheel, but to look for the things that you're already doing that put stories in front of your donors and prospective donors, and look at ways to maybe enrich them and change the angle on the way the story is being told. And I also find it's helpful to kind of assign a level of effort to making this tactic effective. And, being as realistic as possible about that will help you prioritize the tools that you are going to commit to evolving to a more diversified story base versus, things that are just too hard to attempt right now, something that we'll table maybe to next year. And then the next phase that we are recommending is to take an inventory of the tellable stories that you have at your disposal. And rather than, you might align your donor stories with the 9 archetypes specifically, or you can make it a little bit easier on yourself and just align those tellable stories with some of the features and qualities that are true of some of these archetypes, so that you're just simplifying that process a little bit more. Are there elements of risk or leverage that can be found in the donor story? Are there, does it seem like the person is very prescriptive and focused on evidence, or does it seem like that donor is less prescriptive and more sort of deliberately trusting in the way that they've made their gift? And often, donors do think about these things and want to be, they would welcome their story of impact, kind of carrying these additional elements. So in this example, we've got a few that we, are imagining could be demonstrative of some of these ways of thinking about the world. A student who creates a kind of food pantry gift mob for his fellow students, and might be telling a story that's very exuberant and that involves an element of disruption and irreverence, and also has an immediate impact. So that story might resonate with more than one archetype. So we want to sort of just be aware of the tellable stories that are in our universe and in our experience, and be mindful about highlighting and bringing those elements to the surface in the stories that we tell. And then finally, this is a little bit of a donor interview tip sheet that we use as a starting point. And some of the partners that we work with who use this lens of archetypes to think about their donor communications will say that going through this exercise of thinking about those attributes that donors might be resonating with or trying to exhibit to others is an exercise that helps them just adapt as listeners and change the way that they engage with their the current donors that they have relationships with. So this list of questions is something that has evolved from those partnerships. We think it's a great starting point. There are likely going to be other questions that you would add to this as you begin working on it. But the utility of this list, or the intention behind it, is for people that are tasked with creating or writing up a donor impact story that might be shared on the web or on an Instagram feed or somewhere in an annual report, that they have some additional thought starters that can help them probe to that deeper level of revealing what it is that helps exemplify all these different types of ways of thinking about problem solving and impact in the world. So that's a lot to speed through. And I wanted to make sure that there was time for questions. So I will wrap up there and turn it over to Jaron to talk us through some Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Colleen and Andrew. That was really fascinating information and conversation. I really appreciate you sharing it with us. A reminder for everyone that you can submit questions that you have for Colleen and Andrew using the Q&A button at the bottom on your toolbar. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. But first off, I was taking notes furiously and thinking about, which of these archetypes resonate with me. And I think one question that came to mind for me, as you started to talk through some of the toolkit, especially, is I'm hoping you can expand a little bit on how organizations can go about figuring out which of these archetypes might resonate the most with their donors, and then practically, like, how do they adjust their messaging in order to appeal to those archetypes?
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point for the conversation. And one thing that I'll say is true is you may, in delving into the set of archetypes, you may look at one or two of those archetypes and say, that person or somebody who thinks about the world that way might not actually be a great fit for this organization. If there's a donor that is really eager to be disruptive and to sort of throw a little bit of a chaos into the mix, there are some organizations where that's a productive enterprise. And then there are some other organizations who, for whom that would not really be a great fit, or a world builder, someone who is looking at the nonprofit sector as, sort of just another way of organizing interventions in the world, and they'll do what they will to get the outcome that they're looking for, whether it's helpful to the nonprofit or not. So there's, I think, a legitimate moment of evaluating whether all of those archetypes truly are a good fit with your organization, because you don't want to be out there promising belonging to people that aren't really going to be a good fit and helpful to your organization. But if you are identifying people that you think would find, that they would find a good fit with your organization in accomplishing a sort of strategic understanding of what's behind an issue, or any of these other experiences. For the explorer archetype, being able to offer people a way to get their legs as philanthropists and explore and learn from peers, and sort of come to understand what sorts of impact is possible without getting out ahead of themselves too quickly. That is an experience that you have to also be able to promise them, if you're going to be, making yourself welcoming to them. So I think I don't want to belabor this or go on for too long, but that inventory exercise and that step of looking at what you have been communicating to the world could be a good starting point to say, oh, here's an opportunity where I might have told a more nuanced story about the motivation behind that gift. I think that can be really revealing and illuminating for an organization.
Absolutely. Building on that, we got a question from the audience about how do we ensure that these archetypes we're thinking about and sort of crafting our messaging around don't slip into stereotypes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think the way we differentiate stereotypes and archetypes internally is we think that a stereotype is sort of claiming that that's the full story about a person or a character that you see. And an archetype sort of uses a little bit of an inherited awareness or a template of how a person thinks about things, but then elaborates on it and expands on it. So I think it's more, it'll be more true to life and more realistic if you begin to tell a story of a donor and the way they think about problem solving, and let the nuances of their thought process as they articulate it come through, rather than trying to shoehorn them down into representing only one way of thinking about things. I think we want there to be elements of the story that are recognizable and that don't seem like they come out of left field, but then we can also let other elements of the story begin to show nuance that is very particular and personal.
Yeah, it's sort of like the first layer of essentially sort of being able to inform how you'd sort of probe more into what a certain donor is looking for, right? And sort of giving you an idea of, oh, okay, if I'm hearing these sorts of words, I wonder if they might gravitate towards X, Y, and Z. But then that becomes, again, a learning experience, because to Colleen's point, the last thing we want to do is sort of assume that, a couple things that we might be sort of hearing from a donor sort of immediately puts them into sort of a bucket that they might not completely identify with or agree with. So again, it just gives kind of like a starting point and a sort of springboard upon which we can learn more about each of them. And I know that actually sort of gets into, I know that sort of another of these questions, which is sort of how do we use them to sort of guide, like which staff member has them sort of in their portfolio, right? Like consider sort of who is paired with them. Absolutely. Like I think that's kind of spot on, and that what this can do is help understand not only what stories to connect the sort of certain donors to, but how to go about connecting them to that. And, do we Do you have someone on the team that maybe sort of relates to that type of archetype, or can say something like, oh, I'm like you in this way, race, and XYZ, and that sort of creates a level of relatability that you can do. So I think sort of going through this exercise and understanding even who the members of the team, how they map into the different archetypes might help you understand, who to have conversations with and who should be having conversations with certain donors. So I think that's a great point, and I think certainly one way to kind of take it, but it involves some level of an understanding of our own personality types and the ones that make up the team in order to kind of pair them properly with in order to inform some of those conversations. So
I love that. I love that idea of having your own team go through the exercise. I think we all, just by virtue of being here today and doing the poll, we've understood a little bit more inherently what these archetypes are by the exercise of thinking about how we fit in. And so we have a deeper understanding that way. And so it could be really beneficial for before you try to take this out to your donor base to have your team understand where they fit in. It makes it easier to have the conversations. And I'm also hearing you say in a couple different ways, a reminder that this paradigm for thinking is really for the beginning of that funnel, right? It's the entry point. It's the springboard, as you said, Andrew, rather than the how do we craft the ask message for this particular person, right? It's earlier in the process. I want to an interesting question came in around you were talking about the inventory, the storytelling inventory, and how to use that. And an interesting question that I think you all are particularly positioned to answer because you straddle the world of donor communications and marketing is how do you have any advice for working with marketing departments? For most of us, our development professionals here, how can we work with the marketing department in order to start to enable this kind of strategy and help them see how this can help us, but also complement the storytelling we're already doing?
Yeah, I think the question is probably coming from the perspective of an organization where there's a separate marketing team that is not within fundraising. And often when our clients kind of share with us a challenge in that area, um, one of the things that they'll share is that the marketing team thinks that what they're being asked to do is to solicit people through the Instagram channel or through, digital ads or whatever it is that they're promoting. And we try to stress that the story of impact is not, it needs to be thought of in a different category as a solicitation, that talking about the mission of the organization and the impact of the organization needs to go beyond just profiling people that are helped by the organization or making claims about the mission, but also starting to talk about all the people that are part of this community that is concerned about this issue and the ways they think about how they can be helpful. So that, sort of permission to be more expansive in how you think about, as marketers, communicating a story that has to do with fundraising or that's in a way supportive of fundraising without it being an ask, that does help people feel more open to it. I would also say maybe taking those marketers through an exercise of looking at these archetypes and trying to identify with one or the other, that might sort of build their own buy-in or investment in how meaningful it might be to bring stories like that to the surface.
It's really helpful advice. I know I've always struggled with that conversation and exactly what you're talking about. We're not asking you to make an ask. Um, I'm curious if you have seen strategies that work well incorporating this kind of messaging that speak both to welcoming new donors and helping them see themselves in the organization, as well as current donors who were maybe a little bit further along in the funnel. Are those two different strategies, or are there ways to sort of do both?
Well, I think, and Andrew, pile on if you like, but I think that and our experience has been when committed donors or people that have been involved for a while are invited to sort of reflect on not only why they choose this subject area to have an impact in, but what has been their thought process or their learning process, or what has changed for them over time as they think about being involved in um, being of help to this kind of a situation. And when they are given that window to reflect and share, some of how their thinking has evolved or what the experience has meant to them personally, that starts to reinforce or deepen their own connection with the organization. So for many of those folks, they welcome the opportunity to reflect on it, and then will be willing to share testimonials that sort of help show the world who they are. So I think it can work as a relationship cultivation strategy.
Absolutely. That's a great point. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I thought there's one question that came through, and I think it's a good way to wrap up, which is that the toolkit that you laid out and the strategy for sort of moving through the different sessions, it's kind of a lot. It's great, but for those who maybe find themselves in smaller organizations or smaller shops, like what's the one practical thing that you would recommend they or anyone who's like ready to start on this but doesn't really know how? Like, what's the practical step to implement some of this stuff that maybe isn't the whole enchilada?
Colleen, I'm happy to quickly start with that. There's actually sort of specifically designed to be helpful for very small teams, kind of like, using these frameworks, printing them out and just sort of using them to do a bit of an inventory. Because I think the first level is A, getting a sense of your own self. And again, I'm just going to use someone of a staff of one as an example. Getting an understanding of the types of donors that you typically have that come through your organization and why they might be supporting it. And then again, just doing that kind of in your own head, and then going through the inventory of the stories that you have to tell and seeing what questions those stories answer, or what sort of, the things in a couple of those worksheets that Colleen presented, where your sort of gaps might be. Oh, okay, you know what? We're really missing a story that says this and this. And then you can actually go about finding that within the walls of the impact that your organization is making. So I think kind of getting an inventory and seeing where you have where your stories sort of are playing, where those gaps are, I think is probably a good place to start. And that's something that, frankly, like a team of one can do, because ultimately what that helps you do is understand, okay, like where do I need to do a bit more digging? And then when you're getting, let's say, like, you're about to have a meeting with someone, let's say, it gives you a framework for understanding, okay, well, this is the type of, because I know X, Y, and Z about this donor, I think that stories about these sorts of things might be good to share with them the next time I speak with them. So again, it just kind of gives a bit of a head start in terms of not only seeing an inventory of the stories you have, but also informing those direct conversations you might be having one-on-one, right, as a part of a small shop. So yeah, hopefully that helps a little bit. And Colleen,
Yeah.
feel free to add
Yeah,
anything.
I think that's well said. I think just giving yourself permission to approach this enterprise or approach this task, in bite-sized pieces.
Yep.
You might look at in the next 6 months, what are a couple of publications that you're going to be putting out, an annual report, or even a direct mail appeal, and think about, am I telling any donor stories in those situations? And then look for what I call the black box donor story, where it's opaque, where some facts about it, like the amount of the gift and the name of the donor, but nothing more. So what we're hoping to do is replace that black box of like opaqueness with something that's a little bit more transparent into, what was done. And if you can do that with one donor story in the next few months, that's a great start.
Baby steps. We're eating the elephant one bite at a time.
Yes.
Well, Thank you so much. We're almost at time. I want to thank Colleen and Andrew very much for their time today and for sharing all of their insights. This has been a really interesting and robust conversation, and I know I've have a lot of things to take away from it that I'm going to be thinking about. And with that, I'm going to invite Lucinda to wrap us up.
Absolutely. I want to echo that. Thank you, Andrew and Colleen, and thank you, Jaron, for moderating. What wonderful information and really great examples and tools for everyone to take away and get started right away. Thank you, everyone, for joining. This has been a really wonderful, robust session. A couple of quick reminders. This session has been recorded and the slides will be available. So you'll receive an email from us within 24 hours with both the recording and the slides. And that'll be in your inbox. Also, when we conclude here in just a minute, you will be prompted to answer a very short survey. And so we invite you to do so. It's really nice feedback for us. We would love your feedback. So please consider taking our short survey. It'll be on your screen when we end here and also in the email that you receive. And then finally, if we didn't have a chance to answer your questions, please contact us. So here's our QR code. You can find our information there. Our email is info@alford.com. You can email us there. We would love to continue the conversation and answer your questions and dialogue more about the donor archetypes. So with that, again, thank you to our speakers and presenters. Thank you all to all of you for being here and participating. And we're going to conclude today's session. I hope you all have a really wonderful day and afternoon and hope to hear from you soon. Thanks so much. Have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone.